After a long period of working hard together and building a life on their small highland farm, Toan and Ly Tu Diem finally saved enough money to buy their very first motorbike, a small but meaningful achievement that marked an important step in their journey toward building a future together. And the two of them began preparing for a simple yet hopeful wedding. However, just before the wedding day, Toan's mother suddenly appeared, bringing with her a cold and overwhelming sense of authority. She bluntly warned him and demanded that he end the relationship immediately or face serious consequences. Her presence turned everything tense and unstable. Yet despite all of that, Toan and Tu Diem still chose each other and decided to move forward with their marriage. After officially registering their marriage, their lives began to show strange and unsettling signs. Two unfamiliar men appeared in the village, quietly watching their every move, creating a growing sense of unease. And only a few days later, something terrible happened. The motorbike, their first and most precious possession earned through hard work, was stolen in the middle of the night, leaving Toan and Tu Diem not only with a painful loss, but also a clear feeling that the real trouble had only just begun. The strange signs had started much earlier, but at first, they both tried to convince themselves that it was nothing more than imagination. On the afternoon before the theft, when Tu Diem went down to the stream to fetch water, she felt as if someone was standing on the distant hillside watching her, a figure motionless behind the bushes. But when she turned to look more carefully, there was no one there. And yet the feeling of being watched followed her all the way home. Meanwhile, Toan noticed unfamiliar footprints near the livestock pen, large and deep, unlike anyone in the village, as if someone had stood there for a long time, observing, waiting. But when he asked around, no one admitted to being there. Night fell faster than usual. The highland air turned cold and eerily quiet, so silent that even the rustling of dry leaves could be heard clearly, still uneasy. Toan pulled the motorbike closer to the front of the house and carefully locked it with an old chain. He told Tu Diem to shut the doors tightly and not go outside if she heard anything strange. But even then, the sense of unease did not disappear. It lingered in every dark corner, in every pause of the night. Around midnight, a strong gust of wind made the wooden door creak. Tu Diem suddenly woke up. She sat up and listened. At first it was just the wind, but then she heard another sound, very faint, like metal lightly touching, followed by soft footsteps on the ground. Her heart began to race. She turned to wake Toan, but he was still sleeping deeply after a long day of work. She hesitated for a few seconds, not daring to wake him, thinking perhaps it was just her imagination. Outside, two shadowy figures moved silently in the darkness. They walked slowly and carefully, as if already familiar with the terrain. One stood watch, eyes scanning the surroundings, while the other crouched near the motorbike, quickly checking the lock. A faint metallic sound echoed. Enough to tighten the tension in the air, he pulled out a small tool and worked swiftly and precisely. Within seconds, a soft click was heard. The lock was opened. Inside the house, Tu Diem heard the sound again, clearer this time. She held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly it felt like it could be heard. She slowly got up and stepped toward the door, peeking through a narrow gap, but the darkness was too thick to see clearly. She could only make out the vague shape of someone bending down. She wanted to scream, to call Toan, but an invisible fear froze her. Her throat tightened. No sound came out. Outside, the motorbike was slowly pushed away, the wheels rolling gently over the ground to avoid noise. One man pushed while the other kept watch. Once they were out of the yard, they climbed onto the bike but did not start it immediately. Instead, they pushed it further away before finally turning on the engine. The sound was low and quickly disappeared into the night, leaving behind only a cold, empty silence. The next morning, as sunlight just touched the front yard, Toan stepped outside as usual. But in that very moment, he froze, his eyes fixed on the spot where the motorbike had been. The yard was completely empty. The chain lay loose on the ground, the lock broken apart. Everything was so silent it felt suffocating. Tu Diem stepped out behind him, and when she saw it, she could not speak. She simply covered her mouth as tears began to fall. Toan bent down and picked up the broken lock, his hands clenched tightly, his gaze darkened. He needed no explanation, no further guesses, because in his mind, everything was already clear. This was not a random theft. It was a warning, a calculated move, and the motorbike was only the beginning. That night, Tu Diem barely slept. She sat by the window staring at the empty yard where the motorbike once stood. Her heart felt hollow beyond tears, while Toan stood silently outside, his fists clenched so tightly they turned pale. He was not angry about losing the property, but about the helplessness. For the first time since leaving his old life behind, he realized that there were things he could not protect with willpower alone. The next morning, Toan decided to search for the motorbike. He asked everyone in the village, from the elderly to the young men, but all of them shook their heads. No one knew anything, or no one dared to speak. The way they avoided his eyes only made him more certain that this was no ordinary theft. Tu Diem began to notice the small, strange details she had previously ignored. The unfamiliar footprints near the farm, the presence of the two strange men appearing in places they should not be, and the lingering feeling of being watched whenever she went to the stream or the fields. She told Toan everything, her voice trembling. But Toan remained silent, because in his mind, the pieces were slowly coming together, and only one name stood out: his mother. That afternoon, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Toan walked alone down the narrow path leading out of the village, the place where he had once seen the two men smoking. The air was eerily quiet, with only the sound of wind through the trees. And then he saw them, standing at the end of the path, as if they had been waiting for him all along, their eyes no longer hidden, but directly confronting him with challenge. "Give me back the motorbike," Toan said firmly. One of them laughed, a dry, hollow sound echoing in the empty space. "What motorbike?" he replied. But his eyes said everything. Toan stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking, the tension so thick that a single move could ignite everything. But then the other man raised his hand as if to avoid conflict. "Listen," he said, his voice lower now. "This is just a warning." One sentence, but enough for Toan to understand. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. After that confrontation, Toan said nothing to Tu Diem about what he had heard. He did not want her to worry more, but that silence slowly created an invisible distance between them. Tu Diem felt it, but she did not ask, because she understood he was trying to protect her in his own way. In the days that followed, their lives grew heavier. The laughter faded, every step filled with caution, as if something could happen at any moment. One evening, while Tu Diem was preparing dinner, she heard a strange sound behind the house. Not the wind, not an animal, but soft footsteps. She froze, her heart racing, then slowly stepped outside. Darkness covered everything. Only faint moonlight slipped through the trees. And then she saw a shadow move quickly, too fast for her to react. She ran back inside in fear to call Toan, but when he came out, there was no one there. That night, Toan did not sleep. He sat outside, watching the darkness. In his mind, a decision was forming. He knew that if they stayed, things would only get worse. Not just for him, but for Tu Diem and the villagers. But if he left, he would have to face the very world he had tried to escape. The next morning, he told Tu Diem they needed to leave the village for a while, not to run away, but to solve the problem at its root. She stayed silent for a few seconds, then nodded. Not because she understood everything, but because she trusted him. And so they began preparing to leave with no motorbike, little money, just a few simple belongings, and an unshakable determination. But just before they left, the village chief appeared. He looked at them for a long moment, then said something that made them both freeze. "Even if you leave, you won't escape." His voice was low, filled with concern. "Because the person behind this doesn't just want the motorbike." Toan looked straight at him. "Then what do they want?" The village chief fell silent. After a long pause, he finally said, "They want you to go back." No more words were needed. Toan understood. Everything had come full circle. He had tried to run, but the past would not let him go. Tu Diem looked at him, her eyes no longer filled with fear but with determination. She held his hand and softly said, "No matter what you choose, I'm still here." That sentence made Toan pause. For the first time, he realized that his decision no longer affected just him, but both of them. The wind grew stronger. The trees swayed. In the distance, a strange car appeared at the foot of the mountain, standing still, as if waiting. The story ends with Toan staring down the road leading away from the village, where all the answers awaited him, but also where everything he had built could be destroyed. And this time, would he keep running, or finally turn back and face it? The air grew heavier as Toan stood there, his eyes fixed on the distant road, his thoughts racing between the past he had abandoned and the fragile life he had just built. Every memory of hardship with Tu Diem flashed through his mind, the laughter, the struggles, the quiet moments that gave his life meaning again. And yet beyond that road was a world filled with power, control, and unfinished battles waiting for him. A world that would not stop until it pulled him back. His fingers tightened around Tu Diem's hand, as if afraid that letting go even for a second would mean losing everything. And in that silent moment, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever choice he made next would change their lives forever, with no way to turn back.